It was just past 10 in the morning when Raymond Carter pulled his sleek black Lincoln Continental into the rest area along Interstate 94, roughly 40 miles west of Lansing, Michigan. Dressed sharply in a charcoal gray suit paired with a crisp light blue dress shirt, he appeared to be someone headed to an important business engagement, which he absolutely was. A polished leather briefcase rested on the passenger seat, containing vital documents for the governor's policy roundtable meeting scheduled for noon. Raymond had dedicated over 2 decades of his life serving as a district court judge, earning statewide recognition for his composed demeanor and unwavering commitment to fairness. Yet none of those accomplishments would matter when a white state trooper's patrol car pulled up behind him, emergency lights blazing. From inside his cruiser, Officer Jeffers scrutinized the scene with suspicious eyes. To him, a black man sitting alone in an expensive vehicle at a rest stop raised immediate red flags. He quickly radioed his partner, Officer Reich, who was only minutes away. Without waiting for backup to arrive, Jeffers stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward the Lincoln. Raymond, sensing the officer's approach, rolled down his window and kept both hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. "Good morning, officer," he said with remarkable composure. "Is there something wrong?" Jeffers didn't respond immediately. He studied Raymond from head to toe with a calculating stare that made no effort to conceal its suspicion. "We received a report about a stolen vehicle, matching this description leaving a nearby gas station," he stated, his voice sharp and emotionless. Raymond blinked, not with fear but with genuine confusion. "I'm not aware of any such report," he replied calmly. "I've only stopped here briefly before continuing into the city. If you'd like, I can show you my vehicle registration." Rather than accepting this reasonable offer, Jeffers stepped back and placed his hand on his holstered weapon. "Step out of the vehicle immediately," he commanded aggressively. His tone had completely transformed, no longer even pretending politeness, now filled with presumption and raw authority. Raymond's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't want confrontation, but he wasn't about to argue on the roadside. He opened his door slowly and stepped out, his 6-foot frame remaining calm and dignified. By the time Officer Reich arrived on scene, the situation had already spiraled out of control. Jeffers had Raymond positioned at the rear of his vehicle with his hands raised, while Reich watched uncertainly but remained silent. "I'd like to understand what exactly I'm being accused of," Raymond said, his voice still measured, but carrying unmistakable firmness. "I haven't committed any wrongdoing." Jeffers ignored the question entirely. Instead, he walked around to Raymond's door, reached inside the vehicle without permission, and began searching through the glove compartment. Raymond took a small step forward. "Officer, I do not consent to any search of my vehicle," he declared clearly. That was all Jeffers needed to hear. "That's obstruction," he snapped. "You're interfering with our investigation." Before Raymond could respond, Jeffers grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and secured a handcuff. Reich hesitated momentarily, but when Jeffers nodded in her direction, she moved forward and fastened the other restraint. Raymond didn't resist. His voice, quiet but penetrating, cut through the tense atmosphere between them. "You're making a tremendous mistake." The entire scene unfolded in front of several travelers who had stopped for coffee or to stretch their legs. One of them, a young college student enjoying spring break, had already pulled out her phone and begun recording from across the parking lot. A retired veteran shook his head slowly and muttered under his breath, "That gentleman doesn't look like someone who would steal anything." Jeffers and Reich didn't notice the observers. They were completely focused on escorting Raymond to the back of their patrol car, as if they had apprehended someone truly dangerous. But Raymond walked with dignity, even with his hands restrained behind his back. His head remained held high, not in arrogance, but in quiet disbelief that decades of distinguished service, countless honors, and extensive legal expertise could vanish instantly, reduced to nothing more than a racial profile and baseless assumption. As he sat in the back seat of the police cruiser, Raymond remained silent. He gazed out the window, past the parking lot, past the blurred trees, as if searching for something deeper than the chaotic scene surrounding him. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was calculating, thinking, planning. He understood something the officers didn't. This situation would not end the way they expected. Inside the state police precinct just outside Jackson, Michigan, Raymond Carter sat quietly on an uncomfortable plastic chair. His hands were no longer restrained, but the red marks around his wrists told the story of his treatment. The booking officer had examined his identification, but didn't seem to look carefully, just typed the information like it was another routine entry. To them, Raymond was simply another middle-aged black man brought in under suspicion. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't arguing. That made him, in their eyes, even more suspicious. People who remained calm, who didn't show anger, were sometimes viewed as concealing something. The officers didn't recognize his composure as discipline. They mistook it for guilt. Officer Jeffers walked past the holding area repeatedly, each time glancing at Raymond with barely concealed irritation. Officer Reich stayed quieter, remaining mostly in the background, occasionally appearing uncomfortable, but saying nothing. Raymond had been detained for nearly 2 hours. No phone call, no explanation, just waiting. He had requested 3 times in a respectful and clear tone to contact his office, explaining that he had a crucial appointment in Lansing. Each request was either dismissed or completely ignored. Around him, the precinct hummed with quiet conversation, the clicking of keyboards, and occasional radio communications. Other officers moved in and out of rooms, giving Raymond passing glances but never truly engaging. Some even smirked at. They noticed he wasn't dressed like someone from the street, the polished shoes, the tailored pants, the confident posture, but that just made him more of a curiosity. Someone even muttered, "Thinks he's special." Raymond heard it, but he didn't react. Jeffers finally entered the holding area again and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "So, are you going to tell us why you were sitting there with your engine running? Were you casing the area waiting for someone?" His tone was more mocking than genuinely inquisitive. Raymond looked up, his voice remaining calm. "I was reviewing directions on my phone. I had a meeting in Lansing, that's all." Jeffers scoffed. "You people always have a story." Reich, standing behind him, shifted slightly but didn't speak. Raymond didn't respond. He recognized the pattern. They were waiting for him to lose control to give them justification to escalate further, but he wasn't going to provide them that satisfaction. He had spent too many years on the bench listening to stories like this from young men who never had the opportunity to be heard. He wasn't about to perpetuate that cycle. After some time, the shift supervisor, Sergeant Pamela Yates, came through. She was in her early 50s with graying hair neatly tucked into a bun and sharp eyes that missed very little. She stopped when she saw Raymond. "How long has he been here?" she asked, directing the question to no one in particular. "Almost 2 hours," someone answered from a nearby desk. "Obstruction and vehicle match." Yates frowned and walked over to Raymond. "Sir, have you been advised of your rights?" Raymond nodded once. "Yes, ma'am, but I haven't been permitted to call my office. I've asked multiple times." She looked at him more carefully now. Something about his tone, clear, calm, precise, made her pause. "What's your name again?" she asked. "Raymond Carter," he said, "and I strongly recommend someone checks that name before this mistake becomes much bigger." Jeffers chuckled from behind her. "He's been pulling that important man act since we brought him in." Yates shot him a look that silenced him immediately. Then she turned back to Raymond. "Let me see what we have." She walked to the nearest computer terminal, typing as she went. It would only take a few minutes, but Raymond already knew what she would discover. For now, he sat back, silent once again, waiting for the moment when the entire room would shift. It was coming. He could sense it. Sergeant Pamela Yates stared at the screen in front of her. Initially, she scanned it casually, expecting to see a clean background, maybe a couple of traffic violations. But the moment Raymond Carter's name loaded in the system, her eyebrows furrowed. A lengthy list of credentials appeared. Academic honors, legal appointments, judicial certifications. Then it hit her. Judge Raymond L. Carter, presiding judge, 14th District Court, State of Michigan. Her eyes widened slightly. She double-checked the photo on file. It matched the man sitting quietly in the holding area. She looked back over her shoulder at him through the glass partition, then back at the screen, blinking once as reality sank in. She rose quickly, her boots making soft but sharp sounds across the precinct floor. As she reached the holding area, Jeffers was still leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking smug. Reich stood nearby, trying to avoid Raymond's gaze. Yates didn't speak immediately. She opened the door and stepped inside. Raymond looked up at her as calm as ever. "You said you had a meeting in Lansing," she began. "Yes," Raymond replied. "At noon. I was invited to join a justice reform roundtable with the governor." Yates took a deep breath. "And you are Judge Raymond Carter?" He gave a slight nod. "That's correct." There was a pause, and then she said, "Your Honor, I apologize. This should never have happened." Behind her, Jeffers straightened up. "Wait, what do you mean?" "Your Honor." Yates turned slowly toward him. "You arrested a sitting state judge without probable cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant, and you denied him his right to contact legal counsel." Her voice was steady but ice cold. "This is extremely serious." Jeffers' confidence cracked. He wasn't acting like a judge. He didn't have to, Yates interrupted. You had his identification. It was your responsibility to verify it. Instead, you escalated without justification. She turned to Reich. You too. You assisted in handcuffing a man without proper cause. Do either of you have any idea what this means? The silence in the room was overwhelming. Jeffers opened his mouth, but no words came out. Reich's face had turned pale. Yates turned back to Raymond again. Sir, I'm sorry. Would you like to contact the governor's office now or have someone drive you there? Raymond gave a small smile. Not smug, just weary. Yes, I would. Thank you, Sergeant. She nodded and escorted him out of the holding room, her tone and posture now completely transformed. The buzz in the precinct had shifted. Officers glanced up from their desks, confusion on some faces, embarrassment on others. The man they thought was just another quiet arrest now moved through the building with quiet authority and fully restored dignity. And as he exited the building with a phone in hand and Yates walking beside him, everyone left behind understood that this was far from over. By early evening, the first video had already gone viral. A 27-second clip recorded by a college student at the rest stop showed Judge Raymond Carter being handcuffed by Officer Jeffers while calmly asking what he had done wrong. The student's voice could be heard in the background saying, "This is absolutely insane. He didn't do anything." The video spread like wildfire across TikTok, then onto Twitter and Facebook, with the caption, "Man arrested for being black in a suit." Within hours, it had accumulated over 500,000 views. By midnight, it had crossed 2 million. Local news outlets picked up the story before dawn, followed quickly by national media. Screenshots of Raymond's judicial profile appeared alongside freeze frames of the arrest. The contrast between his dignified appearance and the rough treatment he received sparked widespread outrage. Hashtags like #Judge Carter, #Justice for Raymond, and #Rest Stop Profiling began trending across social media platforms. Civil rights leaders, attorneys, and politicians began issuing public statements. Some called for the immediate suspension of the officers involved, while others demanded deeper investigations into the department's practices. The governor's office, after confirming Judge Carter's scheduled appearance at the roundtable, issued a brief but pointed statement. "We are reviewing the incident and remain committed to equity and justice across all state agencies." Community organizations scheduled press conferences. Protesters gathered outside the Jackson precinct by late morning, holding signs that read "Judged before justice" and "Dignity in cuffs." What affected people most wasn't just the arrest, it was the silence in Judge Carter's face as it happened. He didn't resist. He didn't yell. He simply looked like a man who had witnessed this kind of thing too many times before. That quiet composure struck a nerve. He became a symbol not just of wrongful arrest, but of how deeply rooted the problem was when even someone at the top of the justice system couldn't avoid the sting of racial bias. Inside the precinct, the mood had shifted dramatically. Officer Jeffers had been called into an emergency review meeting. Reich remained mostly silent, shaken. Sergeant Yates fielded calls from Internal Affairs, the media, and legal counsel. She was now cooperating with the state attorney general's office. No one laughed or smirked anymore. A copy of the viral video had been sent to every computer in the building, and many watched it with clenched jaws and quiet shame. Some younger officers, especially those newer to the force, whispered to one another about whether this might finally be the moment something actually changed. For once, the system had turned its spotlight inward, and this time, it wasn't going to look away. The next morning, the rotunda of the state capitol was unusually quiet. Reporters lined the marble hallway outside room 312, where the Justice Reform Roundtable was about to begin. Cameramen adjusted their equipment while aides whispered updates into their phones. The governor's staff had already arrived, along with members of the state judiciary and policy experts. But all eyes were on the large oak double doors, waiting for the man whose name had been on every screen for the last 18 hours. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the doors opened. Raymond walked in, composed and focused, wearing a crisp, dark blue suit, the same leather briefcase in his hand, and that same quiet dignity he had carried through the arrest. The room hushed for a moment, the noise of politics faded into something more human. Everyone stood, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect did. He gave a short nod and took his seat at the head of the table. The governor, seated across from him, leaned forward and said, "Judge Carter, we're honored to have you here." Raymond responded with a simple, "Thank you, Governor. I believe the timing speaks for itself." Before the discussion on policy could begin, Raymond requested to address the room. "Yesterday morning," he began, "on my way to this very meeting, I was stopped, detained, and handcuffed by 2 officers of our own state police. There was no warrant, no probable cause, only baseless suspicion tied, I believe, not to my behavior but to my appearance. The video speaks for itself." His voice was steady but carried a gravity that filled the room. "This isn't just about me. I'm not the first person this has happened to, and unless we act, I won't be the last." Across the table, several officials nodded quietly. One younger assemblywoman wiped away a tear. Raymond continued, "We speak often of trust between law enforcement and the community, but trust cannot exist without accountability. And dignity, especially the dignity of innocent people, cannot be optional." After his remarks, the agenda shifted. What had been planned as a technical discussion about training standards and hiring practices became something far more urgent. Video clips were played, legal experts weighed in, and civil rights leaders were called into the room. Then came the moment no one had expected. An emergency hearing was called to begin the review of misconduct charges against officers Jeffers and Reich, and Judge Carter himself was appointed to oversee the session as a neutral authority. He hesitated at first, wanting to avoid any perception of personal bias. But after the governor's legal counsel confirmed that no ethical barrier existed, Raymond accepted. 2 hours later, in the lower chamber, the officers entered a formal review session packed with media, state staff, and a few community members who had managed to gain access. Their usual confidence was gone. Jeffers looked pale, his jaw set tight. Reich kept her eyes on the floor. Raymond sat at the center of the panel, flanked by two other judges and the state attorney. "We are not here to relive public embarrassment," he said, opening the session. "We are here to evaluate conduct and determine whether the actions taken violated both legal standards and human decency." Video evidence was reviewed again, along with reports from witnesses, timestamps, and body camera footage that contradicted the officers' written statements. Reich, when pressed, admitted she hadn't reviewed the identification or run the name through their system. Jeffers tried to argue he followed procedure, but his voice shook under cross-examination. When asked why he ignored the request for a phone call, he stumbled through an answer about departmental discretion that didn't hold up. Raymond remained professional throughout, but his tone never softened. The authority in his voice made it clear that the days of casual abuse and unchecked power were ending, starting now, starting here. The review session ended just after 5 o'clock in the evening. The panel of judges, after hours of evidence, witness accounts, and legal review, reached a unanimous decision. Officers Jeffers and Reich were found to have acted with negligence, violated protocol, and failed to uphold the basic rights of the individual they detained. The ruling recommended both officers be suspended without pay, pending a full investigation by the State Attorney General's office. The official wording was clear. The incident reflected a misuse of authority grounded in personal bias and a dangerous lapse in professional judgment. When Raymond read the final recommendation aloud, the room was silent. Jeffers didn't say a word, his mouth tight, his eyes locked on the table. Reich nodded slowly, as if accepting a truth she had already known deep down. Cameras outside the chamber caught every second of their exit. Protesters who had waited all day quietly stepped aside as the officers were escorted out of the building. There was no cheering, no shouting, just a heavy silence, the kind that lingers after truth has finally been spoken. At a press conference held later that evening, the governor stood at the podium with Raymond standing quietly beside him. "Today was not about revenge," the governor said. "It was about responsibility." Judge Carter demonstrated the restraint and professionalism that every public servant should aspire to, but it should never have been necessary. He went on to announce new legislation being introduced, a mandatory statewide training program focused on de-escalation, racial bias recognition, and legal rights. In addition, the governor proposed forming an independent oversight committee to investigate future complaints against law enforcement across all counties. The press asked Raymond if he wished to comment. He stepped up to the podium briefly, eyes steady. "What happened to me happens to people without a camera watching, without a title behind their name, without someone to speak for them. This isn't just my story. It's a symptom of a deeper wound, but I believe wounds can heal with enough sunlight, truth, and accountability." The word struck a chord. Within a week, departments across the state began auditing past arrests. Community town halls were organized, legal clinics offered free counsel to citizens who believed they had been unlawfully detained. And across social media, the image of Judge Carter standing in the Capitol, not angry, not vengeful, just firm, became a symbol of justice done right. As for Jeffers and Reich, their suspension triggered an internal review, not only of their actions, but of every case they had been involved in over the last 3 years. Mistakes began to surface, patterns that had long gone unchecked. Raymond, meanwhile, returned to his courtroom. He never once brought up the incident from the bench, never showed special favor, never shifted his tone. But those who entered his courtroom now did so with a new awareness. They understood something important. Justice wasn't just a word carved into stone above the courthouse door. It was a standard, one that Raymond Carter was determined to uphold, even when it meant standing alone. 3 months later, on a bright spring afternoon, Judge Raymond Carter stood on the wide stone steps outside the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy. The trees nearby were beginning to bloom, and a soft breeze moved through the line of flags overhead. In front of him, a new class of cadets stood in formation. 52 recruits dressed in crisp uniforms, eyes forward, shoulders squared. This was the first graduating class trained under the newly implemented bias awareness and accountability standards. Each cadet had undergone extensive courses in community engagement, de-escalation strategies, and constitutional rights. The reforms, once seen as controversial, had become a cornerstone of modern training, and it all started with one video, one moment, and one man who chose to stand firm. Raymond had been invited as a guest speaker. Though he had turned down several public appearances since the incident, this invitation felt different. This wasn't about cameras or headlines. It was about planting seeds where they mattered. As he stepped up to the podium, the Academy director gave him a respectful nod. Raymond adjusted the microphone and began in his calm, steady voice. 3 months ago, he said, I stood on the other side of a badge. I was treated not as a judge, not even as a man, but as a threat based solely on a glance and a guess. That experience could have made me bitter, but instead it made me more committed, not to punishment, but to purpose. He paused for a moment, letting the words settle over the group. You're not just here to enforce laws, Boy, he continued. You're here to protect dignity. That starts with how you see people, every person, not as a risk, not as a statistic, but as someone's father, sister, neighbor, or friend. The recruits listened closely, their expressions more thoughtful than formal. A few nodded subtly, absorbing the weight of his words. Raymond looked out across them and felt something shift. Not just in the air, but in the room, in the culture. There was a seriousness in their eyes, not fear, not pride, just readiness. After his speech, the cadets filed out in pairs, heading toward their families waiting just beyond the training field. A young black recruit paused and turned back. Thank you, sir, he said simply. Raymond gave him a small nod. Go serve with honor. As the crowd thinned and the sun dipped lower, Raymond remained on the steps for a few more minutes. He wasn't thinking about the past anymore, not the handcuffs, not the cold chair in the precinct. He was thinking about what came next. Change didn't always come with noise. Sometimes it came slowly in small moments. One decision, one voice, one classroom, one step at a time. And in that quiet space, Raymond Carter allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice was starting to rise on a new kind of foundation, one built not on fear, but on fairness. Raymond Carter walked away from the steps of the academy that day not as a victim, but as a builder of something better. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, true reform never is, but he also understood that real change starts in the quiet decisions we make when no one's watching. His story is a reminder that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands still, speaks calmly, and waits for the world to catch up. In a country still wrestling with deep divides, Raymond's strength came not from anger, but from purpose. We all have a role to play, whether in a courtroom, a classroom, or our everyday choices. Justice begins with how we treat each other, especially when we think no one will notice. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't let it stop here. Subscribe so you won't miss more powerful true stories that challenge, uplift, and remind us of the quiet heroes among us. Because sometimes the strongest stand is the one taken with calm clarity and courage.